Snow lay heavy upon the earth. A pale shroud stretched from horizon to horizon, swallowing all colour and sound. The world seemed caught between breath and silence, as though time itself had grown weary. In the middle of that vast stillness stood a wooden post, weathered by wind and winter, and bound to it was a young woman whose long hair, white as frost, rippled in the icy breeze like a banner of surrender. Her gown, once stitched for vows and blessing, clung in tatters to her trembling frame, the hem stiff with frozen mud, the sleeves torn from desperate struggle. Her lips, cracked from cold, moved in a prayer so faint it might have been mistaken for the snow's whisper. Around her, shadows slinked against the whiteness, wolves, lean and sharp-eyed, their paws sinking softly into the powder. They did not rush her. They circled, patient as the cold, waiting for her strength to drain further, waiting for the trembling in her knees to falter into collapse. Their hunger was steady, and their eyes gleamed with the knowledge that no one was meant to interrupt their feast. But the girl's thoughts were not on the wolves. They were caught in fragments of memory, the church bells that had rung hollow, the groom who had turned his gaze away as though ashamed, the cruel laughter of men who said her white hair was a curse. She had been bound to the post not for crime, but for difference. Cast out, discarded, and left as carrion for beasts, she was to vanish in silence, with no hands to hold her, no voice to speak her name in kindness. The snow pressed against her lashes, and she closed her eyes, ready to surrender to a fate that seemed less cruel than the one already given her. It was then that a sound broke the stillness, not the cry of a wolf, not the whimper of prey, but the steady rhythm of hooves crunching against the snow. Slow, deliberate, as though belonging to a man who never hurried, who carried time with him rather than chasing it. Out of the pale distance emerged a rider, a lone cowboy, 30 years in this world, his broad shoulders hunched against the wind, a dark hat shadowing eyes that had seen too much of life's harsh dealings. His horse, black as midnight, snorted clouds into the frozen air, carrying both rider and rifle through the endless white. The cowboy's gaze found the wolves first, then the woman. His jaw set with the weight of a decision that needed no words. Without hesitation, he lifted his revolver, the sound of the first shot splitting the quiet like a scar across still water. A wolf yelped and vanished into the trees. Another shot cracked, and the pack scattered, their hunger denied, their shadows swallowed by the forest. Silence fell again, except for the echo of gunfire rolling through the hills. The man swung from his horse, boots sinking into the snow. His hands were rough, scarred by years of rope and iron, yet when he drew his knife to cut the bindings from her wrists, the blade moved with surprising gentleness. The rope fell away, and her body, drained and unsteady, folded toward the ground. He caught her before she touched the snow, his arm steady as stone, his breath warm against her cold cheek. Her eyes opened, pale as moonlight, meeting his. She searched for cruelty there, for mockery, for the judgment she had learned to expect from every man before him. But his gaze was unreadable, carved from silence itself, as if he carried no need to explain why he had stopped, why he had saved her. He did not ask her name. He did not ask her story. He simply held her as though she mattered, though perhaps he had not yet admitted it to himself. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, not softened for her ears but shaped by habit and solitude. "You're mine now." The words fell into the snow like a vow, though he had not intended them as such. He spoke them as a man claiming responsibility for a stray calf found on the range, or a wounded bird too fragile to leave behind. Yet something deeper flickered beneath, something unspoken, something neither of them was ready to name. She did not answer. Her body leaned against his, too weak to resist, too weary to question. He lifted her onto his horse, settling her before him, her thin frame pressed against the steady beat of his chest. The horse turned, hooves retracing steps through the whiteness, carrying them away from the post where she had been left to die. The wolves lingered at a distance, their howls rising behind them like a chorus of bitterness, a reminder that the world still watched, still wanted to reclaim her. Yet she rode with the cowboy now, and his arms held her firm against the storm. She closed her eyes, not in surrender this time, but in a fragile beginning of trust. The snow continued to fall, erasing the signs of cruelty left behind, covering the post, the rope, and the circle of tracks in white. Ahead lay only silence and unknown roads, yet within that silence stirred the faintest glimmer of something more than survival. A story had begun, not of wolves and cruelty, but of two souls bound by accident, carried forward by fate, toward a fire that might yet warm them both. And so the first chapter closed, not with certainty, but with a question lingering in the air, fragile as snowflakes that melt upon the skin. When two forsaken hearts meet in the wilderness, can they become each other's shelter, or will the world tear them apart once more? The horse carried them through the white wilderness until at last smoke rose faintly between dark pines, thin and wavering against the sky. The cabin revealed itself not as a place of welcome, but as a stubborn shape of survival, rough-hewn logs stacked with the blunt hands of solitude. It stood apart from the world, roof bowed beneath the weight of snow, windows shuttered against the cold. No road led to its door. It was a dwelling meant for one, not two, and yet the cowboy dismounted with a bound bride in his arms, as though the cabin had always been waiting for her. Inside, the air was dim, scented with ash and old timber. A fire lingered low in the hearth, embers pulsing faintly like a tired heart. He lowered her onto a pile of blankets near the flames, her white hair spilling like winter itself across the fabric. For a moment she did not move, her breaths shallow, her eyes half closed. He crouched beside her, struck flint to steel, coaxing the fire to life until its glow reached the corners of the room. The warmth crept slowly into her body, chasing the shivers from her bones. He said little. His presence filled the silence more surely than words. He set broth to simmer, a simple stew of venison and potatoes, the kind of meal made by hands that had known no company but hunger. She watched him through the curtain of her hair, wary yet too exhausted to speak. When he set the wooden bowl beside her, she raised it with trembling hands, tasting not just food but the first mercy she had been shown in years. Her lips parted as if to thank him, but no sound came. He did not ask for one. The days that followed moved slowly, measured by the crackle of firewood and the wind against the shutters. Snow deepened outside, sealing them into a quiet world where time could no longer be told by bells or markets or voices. They became the only two souls alive within miles of frost. At first she spoke little, her silence heavy with fear of saying too much, of revealing too many wounds. Yet silence was his language also, and in that shared hush something unspoken began to grow. He worked with a steadiness born of habit, chopping wood until his breath fogged the air, tending the horse with calloused care. She began to move with him, though her steps were unsure. She swept the floor, mended his torn shirts, fetched water from the frozen creek with hands still raw from rope. When she dropped the pail once, he took it from her without reproach, carrying it himself, as though he had always expected her strength to falter and had no judgment left to give. Each night the fire bound them together, its glow softening the rough lines of his face and painting her pale features with warmth. He found himself studying the way she hummed softly when she thought he slept, an old tune with no words, half lullaby and half lament. Once, when a log split too loud in the flames, she startled as though struck, clutching at her chest. He spoke then, his voice rough but steady, telling her there was no danger here. The words carried more than comfort. They carried promise. He shared fragments of himself in that same quiet manner, that he had been a rancher's son, but fever had taken his kin, that he had wandered ever since, owing nothing, seeking nothing, living by his own hand and his horse's endurance. His voice did not break when he spoke, but she could hear the weight in it, the loneliness carved deep. She gave him little of her past, only that her hair had made her both a prize and a curse. Men stared, women whispered, and when her own kin gave her away in marriage, it was not for love but for bargain. She told him she had been bound to the post as one casts off refuse. Her words were steady, but her eyes lowered, as though ashamed of a cruelty that was not hers to bear. He did not press her for more. His silence seemed to say that nothing needed to be confessed before it was ready. Still, she felt the air grow lighter when he was near, as though her burdens were not her own to carry any more. She began to trust the way his footsteps thudded solid on the floorboards, the way his hands handled wood and rope without ever reaching for her in demand. He was a man of roughness, but his roughness was not aimed at her. Winter pressed hard against the cabin walls, but inside it a fragile rhythm formed. They cut wood together, their breaths white and mingling. She mended his gloves while he sharpened tools. She began to laugh once, soft and surprised, when his hat slipped into the snow. The sound startled him more than gunfire, and yet he found himself wanting to hear it again. Still, shadows lingered. One evening, while the wind clawed against the roof, she sat by the fire, her face turned to the flames. Her voice, when it came, was thin but certain. "You saved me," she said, "but I'm not free. Not yet." The words hung heavy in the room. He looked at her across the firelight, his jaw tightening, as though he already knew the truth her silence had been guarding, that what hunted her was not only wolves, but men who would not let her go so easily. He did not answer, not with words. He tossed another log on the fire, and the sparks leapt high, their glow painting the walls with fleeting light. The message was clear enough. He would not abandon her back to the cold. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was promise, it was shield, it was the fragile beginning of something neither had dared hope for. And yet, beyond the cabin walls, the snow carried more than stillness. It carried footsteps that had not yet reached the door, voices that had not yet broken the quiet. The storm had hidden them for now, but storms do not last forever. She knew it, and perhaps, deep within his silence, he knew it too. The storm broke at last, and the cabin no longer stood hidden. The snow thinned, the sky cleared to a sharp blue, and the world beyond their small refuge stirred once more. With the thaw came the sound of hooves upon the hardening ground, a rhythm too measured to belong to chance. She heard them first, her body stiffening as though her bones remembered what her voice could not yet speak. The cowboy stepped to the door, hand resting on the frame, his silence stretched taut as wire. Riders emerged from the pines, for men with hard mouths and eyes that carried no warmth. They were dressed in the dust-worn coats of settlers, armed not only with rifles, but with the pride of men who believed their claim on the world could not be questioned. They looked at the cabin as if it were a stolen thing, then at the woman standing faintly behind the cowboy's shoulder. Recognition sharpened their faces. One spat into the snow, his voice carrying like a whip. "She belongs to us." The words cut her deeper than rope ever had. Her breath faltered, and her hands clutched the edge of the doorframe for strength. The cowboy did not move, did not let them step closer. His reply was low, steady, like iron cooling in water. "Not any more." The men laughed, but it was not the laughter of humor. It was the hollow sound of power mocked. They spoke of bargains made, of vows broken, of tradition that held her as property. Their words dripped with contempt, dismissing her as nothing more than an object returned defective. But the cowboy did not flinch. His gaze fixed upon them, and in that stillness was something that unsettled even hardened men. He repeated the words, slower this time, each syllable weighted. "She's mine now." The riders shifted uneasily, rifles glinting in the pale sun. One warned him that no man stood against their kin and lived unbroken. But they did not linger. pride told them they could return with greater number, that this standoff was not the end but the beginning. They turned their horses, hoofs drumming away into the trees, their threats hanging in the air like smoke that would not lift. When the sound of hoofs vanished, silence pressed heavy upon the cabin once more. She sank into the chair nearest the fire, her face pale, her body trembling as though the cold had found its way back into her veins. He watched her, the set of his jaw softer now, but his words carried a quiet edge. "They'll be back." Her eyes lifted to him, wide with sorrow and guilt. "I don't want blood spilled for me." Her voice cracked, the truth of her fear trembling inside it. She had been unwanted all her life, discarded like scraps. The thought that a man might face death for her seemed more unbearable than the cruelty she had already endured. He crossed the room, kneeling by her chair. His hands rested on the worn wood, steady as stone. "You've been treated as less than human," he said. "That ends here. You don't belong to them. You belong to yourself. And if you'll stay, you'll belong with me." The firelight flickered across his face, carving shadows that softened his roughness. For the first time she let her gaze rest fully on him, searching not for promises but for truth. In his silence, in the steady weight of his presence, she found what she had never been offered, safety without chains. Her heart stirred, cautious yet certain. Days turned again to rhythm, though the air outside carried tension like storm clouds. They worked side by side, yet the distance between them narrowed. She found herself smiling when he handed her tools, laughing once when the snow slid from the cabin roof in a thundering heap. He looked at her then, a fleeting smile ghosting across his lips, as though he, too, had forgotten how lightness felt. One evening, when the wolves howled far in the valley, she moved closer to the fire where he sat sharpening his knife. Without speaking, she leaned against him, her head resting against his shoulder. He froze only for a moment before his body softened, allowing her weight, his warmth answering hers. They sat together in silence, the fire burning steady, the wolves outside unable to touch what had grown inside the cabin walls. Their bond deepened not with grand declarations, but with small moments. The way he set her chair nearer to the fire, the way she left bread on his plate when he thought she had eaten her share, the way their eyes lingered just a little too long before turning away. It was a courtship of survival, of quiet, of souls too scarred to rush yet too lonely to resist. When the thaw of spring touched the air, he spoke again, his words quiet but unshakable. He had no church to offer, no priest, no crowd, only a band of silver worn smooth with years of travel, carried in his pocket without reason until now. He slid it onto her finger with a hand that trembled slightly, not from doubt but from the weight of what he gave. She did not weep. She only nodded, her lips curving faintly, the word yes spoken not with sound but with the meeting of her eyes with his. They were married in silence, with the fire as witness and the snow as choir. No vows were spoken aloud, for none were needed. The promise had already been made when he first cut the rope from her wrists. But peace is a fragile thing. The men returned, more of them this time, their numbers swelling with the pride of kin who believed the land itself bent to their will. Their voices carried across the pines, angry and sharp, promising to drag her back and burn the cabin if they must. The sound of their threat reached her ears, and her body stiffened, fear coursing through her veins like ice. The cowboy stood at the door once more, his revolver steady in his hand, his shoulders squared not only against men but against fate itself. She moved toward him, her hand brushing his sleeve, her voice breaking as she whispered, "If they come for me, let me go. I don't want you hurt." He turned his head slightly, his eyes finding hers, flint and fire bound in silence. His voice, when it came, was low, unyielding. "You're mine now, and I don't let go." The howl of wolves rose again in the distance, answering the storm of men approaching, as if the wilderness itself braced for the clash to come. The cabin, once a place of silence, now held its breath, waiting for dawn and whatever truth it would bring. The night before the storm of men returned, the cabin was hushed as a chapel. Firelight swayed against the walls, its glow dancing across her pale hair, turning it to strands of gold and frost. She sat close to him, though not touching, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Outside, the wolves called from the valley, their voices stretched long and mournful, as though the earth itself knew what was to come. She looked at him through the glow and whispered, fragile but firm, "If they come for me, let me go. I was never meant to be kept. I don't want you broken because of me." His gaze turned to her, steady and unflinching, the silence between them heavy as stone. He shook his head slowly, a gesture more binding than any vow. "You're mine now, and I don't let go." His words carried no hint of possession, only a stark, immovable truth. Something inside her, long starved and aching, steadied at those words. She did not argue again. She leaned closer until her shoulder brushed his, and he did not move away. Dawn came cold, brittle as glass. The snow glimmered in pale light, and the air carried the faint rattle of approaching hooves. She stood behind him at the window, her breath clouding the glass as the riders appeared through the trees. Their numbers had doubled, perhaps more, faces drawn hard with anger, voices carrying the false confidence of men who believed themselves righteous. They dismounted in the clearing, boots crushing snow, rifles resting ready against their arms. The leader, his jaw sharp with arrogance, stepped forward. His voice was loud enough to reach the cabin door. "That girl was promised," he said. "She was given, and we'll have her back, whether by words or by fire. She's cursed and marked, unfit for any decent man, but she belongs to us by blood and bargain." She flinched at his words, shame tightening her chest as though the rope bound her again. But the cowboy opened the door, stepping into the cold without hurry. The frost clung to his coat, his revolver already resting in his hand, not raised yet, but ready. His voice, when it came, was low, carrying further than a shout. "She belongs to no one but herself. But she's with me now." A murmur rippled through the men. Some shifted their rifles. Some spat into the snow. One lifted his weapon higher, testing the weight of his nerve. The standoff stretched long, the silence between words filled only by the restless snorts of horses and the distant cry of wolves. The leader sneered, his pride unwilling to yield. "You think you can stand against us alone? You'll die here, and she'll come crawling back where she belongs." The cowboy's jaw tightened, but his eyes did not falter. "Then I'll die standing, and she'll never crawl again." The first shot cracked the air, sharp as lightning. Snow leapt in a spray where a bullet struck the cabin wall. The cowboy fired back, his aim sure, and one of the settlers fell hard into the drifts. The clearing erupted with thunder, gunfire roaring, smoke rising, men shouting as lead carved through the morning. She ducked inside the doorway, hands pressed against her ears, heart pounding with every shot. Yet through the chaos, her eyes never left him. He moved with the stillness of a man who had fought storms before, his body turning with grim precision, each shot deliberate, each step certain. He was not reckless. He was resolute, a wall of flesh and bone holding back the tide. Men faltered. Some fell. The wolves howled nearer, their voices weaving into the battle like a hymn of the wild. The settlers, arrogant but unsteady, began to break. Pride wavered in the face of death. Their leader shouted, but his voice could not bind their fear. At last, with curses sharp as whips, the survivors mounted their horses, dragging the wounded, leaving the dead to the snow. They fled into the trees, their threats carried off by wind, their strength broken. Silence returned as sudden as it had left, the smoke of gunfire mingling with the white of breath and morning mist. He stood in the clearing, revolver lowered, chest rising heavy with exertion but not defeat. Snowflakes drifted around him, falling soft as blessing upon blood and steel. She stepped out then, her feet sinking into the drifts, her body trembling not from cold but from release. Her eyes, wet and wide, found him where he stood among the remnants of violence. She crossed the distance slowly, each step an act of courage, until she reached him. Her hands, small and scarred, lifted to touch his face. "I was never wanted before," she whispered. "Not truly. Not by kin, not by husband, not by anyone. They saw me as curse or burden. But with you, I am home." His eyes softened, and he let his revolver fall to the snow, uncaring. His hand rose to rest upon her white hair, rough palm against strands that gleamed like ice and fire. He spoke the same words as before, but they were changed, filled now with meaning deeper than survival. "You're mine now, not because you were cast away, not because I saved you, because I choose you." The wolves called again in the distance, but their voices no longer sounded like threat. They sounded like witnesses. The cabin stood firm, scarred but unburned, the snow falling gently to cover the ground, cleansing the marks of blood and boot. Together they turned toward it, not as strangers bound by chance, but as souls who had chosen one another against the cruelty of the world. Inside, the fire burned bright, waiting. They stepped across the threshold, his arm firm around her shoulders, her head resting against him without fear. The silence that filled the cabin was not the silence of emptiness, but of belonging. It was the silence of a story fulfilled, and a new one just beginning. And if you had been there, listening with the patience of the pines, you might have heard the truth carried not in words, but in the quiet, steady beat of their hearts. That love is not always thunder or song. Sometimes it is the stillness of two souls who refuse to let go. Sometimes it is found in the wild, when all else has abandoned you. And perhaps, dear listener, it is the only thing that can turn a cabin of silence into a home, a cast-off bride into a wife, and a wanderer into a man who finally belongs.